And we have some people registering right now. So I'm just accepting their registrations. So.
All right. I have a feeling you're going to be busy for a few minutes after we start.
Yeah.
But that's what we like. The more people that can hear the presentation, the better.
Okay, so just to let everybody know, the broadcasting has started. So we are live right now.
Great. Thank you, Lena.
Yeah.
Well, we're up to about 90 attendees right now. And Brandy, do you want to wait a few more minutes to see if a few more show up, or would you like to get started?
We'll wait just another minute, and then we'll go ahead and I'll get started with the introductions.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening and welcome, everyone. I am Brandy Forbes. I'm the Director of Community Development for the City of Redondo Beach. Tonight's meeting is a presentation of the recommended land use plan. This is the first of many planned meetings engaging the community, the Planning Commission, and the City Council in the discussion. I would like to introduce the panelists for tonight's discussion. From the city, we have Planning Manager Sean Scully and Planning Analyst Lena Portalisi. From the consulting firm Placeworks, we have Wendy Novak, who will be leading the presentation. And then as well, we have Hallie Grundy and Amanda Kennard with Placeworks. Our housing consultant, Veronica Tam, is joining us on the panel. And finally, we have our General Plan Advisory Committee Chairman, Nick Biro, and Vice Chairman Phil Sanchez joining the discussion. So thank you for taking the time to join us this evening and learn more about the current recommendations and the next steps with the land use plan. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Wendy. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Brandy. So yes, welcome everybody. This has been a monumental effort to get to this point. It's 3 years in the making. So we appreciate all of you being here. I know there's been tremendous interest in this topic. We've had about 160 people register to attend, and I can already see there's over 100 of you here. So we really appreciate you spending the time with us this evening to hear and learn more about the recommendations and how we arrived at this point. The purpose of the workshop tonight is to provide the community with an overview of the recommended changes to the land use plan and the land use map, and then to ask the community to provide any questions you have. It's an open house format to get clarity on what's in the mapping, what changed, that sort of thing. And then you will have an opportunity to comment virtually on the map and ask us questions this evening. And then we'll have the map open through the weekend so that those comments can be collected and provided to Planning Commission and City Council for their consideration in their upcoming deliberations and the hearings that they have scheduled in the next couple of weeks. We'll talk a little bit tonight about, the purpose of a general plan. Some of you may have joined us, oh gosh, was it 2 years ago, 3 years ago when we had our first community workshop? So we're not going to go, and there's a lot to cover in this meeting tonight. So at a very high level, what a general plan is. So those of you that didn't get that overview will have context about what the general plan does and doesn't do. Some of the things that have been completed to date, because a general plan often has many smaller tasks that get achieved along the way. So we can share with you what the city has accomplished in the past 2 to 3 years. And then a brief review of some of the issues that the city's been grappling with and the problems that they need to solve as part of this land use plan and how that shaped the recommendations. And so we'll also share with you how state housing laws have changed and what that has meant for the recommendations in the plan. Let's see. So we'll start briefly with a presentation. It'll be a presentation probably about 45 minutes to an hour long. So bear with us on this. Get your popcorn, sit down and relax. We'll go over all of the information that we have, and then we'll have an open house question and answer period. And we say it's open house, but what we're doing is, and I'll show you in a minute on how to provide comments virtually. You can provide comments throughout the presentation, and all the panelists will be able to see the questions, and then we will answer them in an open format at the end of the presentation. So please, ask as you want to go along. We may actually answer your questions along the way, and for those questions that don't get answered, we'll make sure we get to them at the end. And as I mentioned, you'll have an opportunity to provide virtual commenting after tonight's meeting on the map. Here's a brief, just if people haven't used Zoom before, I'm assuming a lot of people have, but please, you'll see that there's a Q&A and a chat feature. We're asking that you provide your comment or your questions in the chat. And so it should say to all panelists so that we all get them. And then we'll track them and answer them at the end of the presentation. Please reserve any comments. So if you're trying to give us feedback or comments on what you would like to see changed, please save that for the map or provide it to us in an email. We're not going to be tracking and keeping track of comments through this chat. This is mainly to answer questions. So as you probably know, you guys will all be muted so that we can go through and talk about the presentation. Your main means of communication with us is through the chat function. And then if you have any technical issues, please email Lena. Her email is at the bottom of this slide, and then she can help resolve it. So if you're having difficulties pulling up something or finding something, we can point you in the right direction. At this point, I'd like to hand over the virtual mic to our chair to give him an opportunity to share with you what the GPAC has been doing for the past 2 or 3 years.
Thank you, Wendy, and good evening to all of you who are joining us. Over the last 4 years, we've had 22 meetings. The GPAC is made up of 27 members, 5 members from each district and 2 that were selected at large. We started in April of 2017, and by rough guess, I think everybody's put in about 200 hours of work in these 4 years, and that's basically meeting time and meeting preparation to get us to this point. So that's a little timeline of all the meetings that we've had throughout this time, and I wanted to share that with all of you that are joining us. Next slide. And then just briefly, what the GPAC is, and so there's not a misunderstanding of, that any of the decisions that you will hear that the GPAC did are not actual policy. These are the recommendations that 27 members of the city have brought forward. Just know that all of this will go to the Planning Commission, will go to the City Council, and there's plenty of opportunities between tonight and by the time this gets set, that you'll have opportunities to speak at Planning Commission or City Council. I'm not going to read these to you. Everybody's in front of their computer. So, this is what we are, this is what we're not. But just very importantly, that there's opportunities to still go through this and get your feedback this evening and get your feedback at the Planning Commission level as well as the City Council level. So, here's all of us. Here's all the members of the GPAC. The asterisk on the names that are labeled on the GPAC members are folks that are no longer with the GPAC. They have moved away or moved out of town, and that was one of the things that pulled these folks from the GPAC and have now joined us for a couple of meetings. Also, we have a list of staff that has joined us throughout this process. And this is where we are right now. This is a little example of what has happened to us, why it's taken us so long. As all of you know, this little Charlie Brown movement of Lucy moving the ball. And we believe that the state completely moved the ball from us. When we started the GPAC, we were going to meet for 10 meetings to be able to go through this. We're on 22 meetings and going longer because throughout the process, we had several state laws that came into place that made us do a couple things that are going to seem a little confusing when we go through. So again, I want to speak to just to listen through this whole entire thing and save all of your questions for the end. There's a lot to digest, so bear with us as we go through a extensive presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And I would like to echo the Chair's comments that in doing the number of outreach meetings that we do and working with different jurisdictions with general plans, this was a very dedicated advisory committee, and it was comprised of individuals from different districts with different opinions on how to resolve things. And one of the things that I would like to acknowledge about the group is that they sat through some very spirited and long discussions debating land use issues that didn't really have a good answer. These are not the easy things, and that's why the advisory committee was pulled together. So we appreciate the input that they have provided, and, alluding to Nick's Charlie Brown cartoon, there's tough decisions that need to be made. And, I don't think that you could say everybody is in agreement with all of them, but I think you can say that the group worked to try to have a compromise and look at the trade-offs, and the things that you are seeing are the best recommendations that they could put forth with the information that we have and the problems that need to be solved. So I really want to commend the group for having the stick-to-itiveness to work through and come up with the recommendations that are being provided to everybody tonight. So what is a general plan? A general plan is the blueprint for how a community evolves over time. So it looks at how it develops, where land uses are placed. It looks at open space and conservation and circulation. And it's really that guiding document that decision makers use to see how different projects relate to the vision that the community has for itself. There are 8 required general plan elements. They're like chapters of a book. These are all of the elements, and the general plan in this case is focusing on the update in and of itself is going to update all of the elements with the exception of circulation. That will be done at a later date. And so this evening, we're really focusing on the land use map, which is part of it, but there will still be discussions even after the land use discussions related to land use policy, open space, and other things that we'll talk about in a little bit. I should point out that housing is also on the front burner, if you will, for a priority for us to address, because the housing element has a little bit different timeline because it is one of the few elements that is required to be adopted by the state. They have a adoption deadline of October 15th of this year. So there are policies and directions that we need to provide in the housing element by that time, and that's in advance of all of the other elements. So the discussion that we're having tonight with you about the recommendations, and we'll be having with Planning Commission and Council, is to help inform what goes in that housing element. So the general plan covers the entire city. It has maps. We talked a little bit about goals, which are that high level, what we want to achieve, starting to drill down into policies, and then down to implementation actions, which are direct actions that the city can take to start to implement the big ideas that are addressed in the vision, goals, and policies. It is not a zoning document, so you will not see setbacks, building heights, landscape requirements. The zoning is the implementing tool of the general plan. It is not design guidelines. I mean, it will have things that will encourage some activity centers, or that a special, design features should be included, but not the detailed design guidelines with architecture and that sort of thing. A general plan is also not a guarantee for project approval. If land uses are shown on a map, that each project still has to be reviewed on its own for its own merits, and then address issues that are related to site design, traffic, school fees, and all of those sorts of things. So this is one layer of the direction of how the land uses should look, and then the actual applications and zoning will implement that. So why are we updating the general plan in the first place? I guess it is 4 years ago. It becomes a blur. 4 years ago, the council directed us and staff to update the general plan because there were several issues that were being called out as important to address by the community. And so one of those things was talking about mixed use, where it applies, what it looks like, looking at how the city addresses its open space needs, really rethinking the commercial corridors and areas like Artesia Boulevard, which we'll talk about in a little bit. There are also legislative changes. So usually a jurisdiction won't update their general plan if maybe every 20 years if they're lucky. And so there are several legislative changes related to housing, environmental justice, climate adaptation, resiliency, and complete streets that the current general plan needed to integrate to be consistent with state law. So where are we now? What's happened on the different projects? As I mentioned previously, the city had reviewed and have drafted the general plan vision and guiding principles, which address community character and livability, economic prosperity and sustainability, and features like health and vitality. There was also an adoption of the Artesia Aviation Corridors Area Plan, or the ACAP. We'll talk about that a little bit more in detail. Market studies were completed to help inform the land plan. So we needed to understand what uses were in demand in the city and what uses people were going to other places for, and how that would affect what types of things should be changed on the map. The city prepared and adopted a local hazard mitigation plan. So that has a lot to do with the safety element. And that is important because if in the event of a disaster, the city will now have access to certain FEMA funds that they did not have before. So it provided those additional assurances for the city and access to funding. A lot of outreach has been completed, mostly with the GPAC, but we've had community workshops, pop-ups. I know staff has gone to several meetings. And the obviously General Plan Advisory Committee has met 22 times. Now, all of these things that we're talking about here and the things that have been achieved to date are available to be viewed on the city's website. Every single thing has been posted. So if it's the General Plan Advisory Committee meetings, the ACAP, the market studies, they're all there for your review. So moving forward, what kinds of things did the city have to think about when we're looking at these recommendations, and what kinds of things did the GPAC have to strategize about to develop some recommendations? And a lot of the discussion focused on several topics. One, growing population, an aging population, lack of affordable housing, the changes in the retail environment. How are people shopping these days? What does that look like? And the availability of jobs in the city. These are the things that were most important and kind of elevated to the top of issues to discuss. Here are a few interesting statistics that kind of came out of that first discussion. And it's the number of people, it's about 3,000 people that the city is anticipated to naturally grow over the next 20 years. So I should also mention that the lifespan of a general plan is about 20 years. So when we're looking at how many units we need to grow each year over the course of that general plan, it's about 64 units a year. And another interesting statistic is that for a person that is making the median income, so it's about $100,000, a little over $100,000, if they can make a 20% down payment, only 1.2% of the homes in Redondo are affordable to that person. So we're looking at how do you have housing diversity, where is it located, and how do you provide that so that Redondo is a livable community for families and all life stages and lifestyles. Then another interesting fact for Redondo is that, which I'm sure doesn't surprise a lot of you, that about 92% of people leave Redondo Beach to go to work. So when we're looking at traffic issues, that's one of the things we look at is how do we provide jobs so that more people can stay working in Redondo versus driving elsewhere. We talked a little bit about the housing consideration and the new statewide housing demands. Like we mentioned, the city is required to have the capacity to accommodate housing for people of all income levels, including affordable and low income persons. The new state legislation, there is SB 330 and SB 166, and both of these are essentially intended to make sure that the city doesn't lose capacity or reduce its capacity to provide housing. So for instance, SB 330 says that you cannot create like a land use plan or show less units than your capacity was January 1st of 2018. So that makes it a little bit challenging because the original plan, when the GPAC was talking about certain things, they were looking at reducing housing in certain places. And so when we're talking about this changing goal line or the changing goalposts, that was something we had to go back and look at because the GPAC had made some recommendations that looked at lessening housing and we needed to put that back. The no net loss talks about if a site doesn't get developed at the capacity that it has been identified for, so it gets developed at a lesser capacity, the city has to find either another site or at least have a buffer of other places that it can accommodate those units that weren't being built. So that has to be done. If there are no buffer sites to pull from, they have to rezone properties within 6 months to make sure that they are not losing that capacity to develop housing. You'll hear a lot about something that's called RHNA, or the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. And so one of the ways that the state helps or tries to ensure that cities are doing their fair share or getting their fair share of housing is by creating this allocation per jurisdiction. So we know that the population growth is outpacing the housing production. The state determines the need of how much housing is needed and then allocates a certain number of units to each region. So ours is the Southern California Association of Governments, SCAG region. That region comes up with its own methodology on how to assign the city with its fair share of housing and then distributes that, gives that number to them. In this case, the city's RHNA is 2,490 units, so almost 2,500 units. When we're looking at the allocation, it's not just a straightforward number of 2,500 units. The allocation is also broken up into income levels. So the city needs to show that it has capacity to provide very low and low income housing opportunities for 1,444 units. And then for a moderate and above moderate, it's about a little over 1,000 units, 1,050. Now you'll see on this slide, it talks about a 20% buffer, and I mentioned that earlier. It is a kind of a best practice, and Veronica can go into this in more detail in the question and answer, but to provide a little bit of a buffer on the very low and low in the event that some of these projects don't build out with the exact numbers that we were estimating, so that you have some room to still accommodate those and meet those numbers. So that's why we add that 20% buffer on the low and very low. The city, when we're looking at satisfying those requirements, there's a lot of details, but when we're looking at finding spaces for very low and low income housing, those units have to be at least 30 dwelling units or per acre or greater. They must also be at least a half an acre in size. So there's criteria that HCD, which is the Department of Housing and Community Development, who reviews the housing element, will look for when we are submitting these sites for their consideration to certify the housing element. On the moderate income and above moderate, those can be less than 30 dwelling units per acre, but the city already has quite a few of those, and we're in a good spot to satisfy that requirement. So what does a housing element do? Similar to what does a general plan do? The housing element demonstrates that a jurisdiction has the capacity to build the number of units identified in their RENA, plus our buffer. So we look at the land uses and we look to see if we can count those units and make sure we have enough space to accommodate the units. Now, it does not require anybody to build the units. It does not force any businesses to close to build units or churches to close. It doesn't require a property owner to sell a property, or it doesn't provide funding for the housing. And it doesn't provide the authorization for the construction of the new units. They need approval, just like we talked about earlier. The housing element process is very involved. And since we only have about an hour or a couple hours to go over the recommendations and things, we have added a frequently asked questions on the housing element, which gets in a lot more detail about housing element requirements and how the city's been approaching that. That is on the website. So we have that there for your review. So let's start talking a little bit about the recommended land use changes. So the big idea is when GPAC was meeting and we're figuring out, okay, where do we focus these changes? How do we know where to start in the community? The idea was, first and foremost, to retain, to the greatest extent possible, all of the existing established residential neighborhoods and the principal commercial districts that are in the city. We look for opportunities for infill development, and so recycling the uses that are either underutilized or finding more uses that are more compatible with the neighborhoods. We're looking at ways to focus the development in particular like corridors or nodes, and finding ways that you can enhance the economic viability of maybe some underutilized or underperforming uses. And then allowing for a modest intensification of key sites that have these marginal uses, so that the areas that the city would be looking at to effectuate change would be much smaller acreage-wise. We're really looking to concentrate it in as few areas as possible. The recommendations, every time we look at it, we have to go back and make sure the recommendations achieve what the vision set out to do. Looked at where the mixing of uses was appropriate, because that was a charge by the council, is to really look at the mixed use, how it was applied, where, and what that looked like. It really built upon these opportunities associated with the extension of the Green Line. So you have an existing station and a potential future station by the Galleria. So how do we capitalize on that? And then, of course, meeting the state housing requirements. The kind of fundamental basis of the recommendations that you are seeing tonight is that the GPAC had to go back through their original recommendations based upon the new housing laws and make some tweaks to it to meet these numbers. The idea was that we would go back and in that conversation preserve the GPAC recommendations to the greatest extent possible to keep what they had worked so hard to put together for the community and talk about. So we worked through that with them as well. We have also included in this update a kind of a refresh and a polish on the land use definitions, the designation definitions. They have been updated to be kind of modernized, streamlined a little bit, and help to be a little bit easier to administer from the general plan perspective. So what you'll find is, and again, there are handouts on all these definitions. We'll give you a website later where you're commenting, but also the city's website. These will also be available, so you can read them in more detail. But for instance, some of the commercial districts were consolidated and streamlined, and the industrial as well. So we have fewer designations. And in some cases, some areas will allow a greater FAR or floor area ratio because of the consolidation. We added a new mixed use designation, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the central PCH area. And then we also added a new residential overlay definition for two of the other focus areas that will help us satisfy the housing requirements. So I've been talking about these focus areas quite a bit. This is a map that shows the focus areas of discussion. So when we were looking at, you'll see that established neighborhoods, we're looking at avoiding those to do improvements. So we looked at the corridors, as you can see, and these are the two areas, by the green line. Originally, there was discussion about including 190th, and there was a very active and involved neighborhood, and they came to an advisory committee meeting and said, we really like it the way that it is. And the group deliberated and decided that they would remove the discussions about 190th from future change. Now, I do have to say that moving forward, we do have a residential overlay that I will point out a little bit later in an area that is on 190th, but it's only for one parcel, which has an industrial underlying with a residential on top, but it's only for a small area, not the entire corridor. So on the focus areas, Artesia, Aviation, we call the Tech District, so that's the North Redondo Tech District, Galleria, and PCH obviously is one very large corridor that we studied, but it was broken into three pieces: North, Central, South, and then we also talked about Torrance. And I'm going to go through each one of these and how those changed in a minute. When we look at citywide, what has actually changed? The areas that have changed comprise about 470 acres, or almost just under 12% of the total area in the city. They are made of areas where we had an explicit land use change. For instance, and I'll talk to you about these a little bit more, but in North Redondo, in the Tech District, and in Galleria, administrative changes where maybe some of the types of uses were allowed, or the densities or intensities were changed a little bit, or we reflected a change that was more of what's on the ground. So for instance, one of the properties that had an administrative change was the shopping center that's next to the Beach Cities Health District. And so it went from commercial neighborhood to commercial flex to be a little bit more reflective of a use that's there and isn't going away. So there were some cleanup items like that. We had definition changes. So you'll see it's a little bit tough to read on this map, but there's areas of hatches, and all of this again is on both websites we'll be sharing with you. And that would just be an example of, like, up here at Northrop, the FAR increased because of the new definition. And consolidating some of the industrial uses. We have a little tiny area here in central PCH that says area that requires additional consideration. We'll go over this as well when we talk about that area, but the advisory committee was torn on a couple of land uses, if there should be residential or just straightforward commercial, and a portion of that. So we have a survey on that particular focus area where we'd like to get your input as to whether or not there's housing. Now, one of the most obvious questions here is, why isn't AES on the map? Why isn't that shown as a potential area? And at the time that the GPAC had started their deliberations, there was a lot of conversation still going on about AES, how long it would be operating. And so at that point, when the GPAC was established, the scope did not include a review or discussion of AES because there were certain things that were still playing out at the time. Now, that doesn't mean that it can't be considered in the future, but right now, that is why you're not seeing it on here, because that was not part of the charge of the advisory committee. So we'll just keep that in mind moving forward. So how is the recommended plan different than the current plan? Right now, it allows a little bit more housing in areas that didn't have housing before, and I'll go through all of these. So somewhat in North Redondo, there's some area here where we have a residential overlay, and over at the Galleria. There's a few other sites where we increased the density of the uses, so those can be counted for housing sites. And then we also had some changes where we were eliminating mixed use in certain areas, like along Artesia. So I'll walk through each one of those focus areas and the details, and you'll be able to see all of these on the website too. So you can look at the areas and how, what areas are most important to you. So I think this is my cue to switch over to our website here. So at this point, let me see what my next slide is. Yep, okay. So I am going to stop my share and switch over to our other program. And so you guys, we will be giving you this link at the end of the presentation so that you'll be able to go to the same website, but I'm going to give you kind of a quick tour and then jump to each one of the areas. So this is our Plan Redondo land use page. And this will be what you will see when you show up to the page to provide your comments. We will be taking comments through midnight on the 11th on this map. And then we will have that opportunity to take a look at those for a couple days before we have the Planning Commission meeting. And so this whole website will stay up after that, so you can see other people's comments. You will still have access to all of this information, but we will have to close the comments after Sunday so that we can do the analysis for Planning Commission and Council. The page will provide you with an introduction on how to use it, instructions on how, how you use the site, the comments on the map. We have a button that shows you how to comment on the map and tells you when and where. You'll be able to drag these pins down to the map and put them on different land uses and provide us comments on those. You will have access to areas of change. So there will be maps in here, the ones that I was referencing that showed where the 11% was changing. That will all be here. We'll have all of the recommended land use plan, the build out, the new definitions, how it looked from before. All of those are on this recommended land use plan button. And then we have a button that says, look up my property. So the challenge with the map that's over to the right here is that you can generally place a pin on an area, but it doesn't do such a great job showing the actual parcels. So you might want to know exactly what's happening on your parcel. So if you click on this, you'll have a link that goes to another map. You can type in an assessor's parcel number, you can type in an address, and it will tell you exactly what's going on with your property, what it was, what it is, and what it is going to, and how it's changed. So that's the quick overview of the site so that you guys will be at least familiar with it once you come back to visit it, if you so choose, or if you add comments to it. But at this point, what I'd like to do is walk through some of those changes for each one of the focus areas. And so you can do that navigation in two ways. You can either click on the button on the side or you can click on the actual area. So we'll start with Artesia. And I'm going to rely on my colleagues too. We've got 10 areas and lots of information, so I think I'll get it all. But if I forget something, I'll ask them to chime in. So on Artesia, the biggest change, what you'll see is the overall concept for the area for Artesia is that it's the main street of North Redondo. So being a walkable place, the idea of it's a walkable, active commercial corridor. The deliberations with the advisory committee were to remove the mixed use in this area. So I'm going to scroll down a little bit, jump into the detail. You can click on the plan. So the recommended plan here is that originally there was mixed use on this area of the west end of the corridor, and that was changed to commercial neighborhoods. So what you'll see is this whole area is commercial of some sort. The one difference with the commercial is they bumped up the floor area ratio here from 0.5 to 0.6. So that way, the businesses there were identifying that they were having challenges, trying to do something new with their business. Now, we also know parking is an issue too. So that's something that's going to be studied in the Artesia Aviation Corridor Area Plan. But that was one of the ways that the committee had talked about helping to facilitate turnover and redevelopment of some of those uses.
Wendy, we had a question in the chat asking what floor area ratio was. Can you explain that?
Sure. Thank you. I know we talk about all these planning terms. So it's if you have a floor area ratio of, let's just say 0.5, and you have a 10,000 square foot lot, that means you can do 5,000 square feet of building on that lot. So sometimes it is, you could do 2 stories of 2,500 a piece, or it just tells you how much actual development can occur on that site. Thanks, Hallie. Okay, so that, I'm trying to think if there's a few other highlights.
Maybe just a couple of comments, Wendy, if I may, about Artesia Boulevard, just for everybody's benefit. The GPAC spent a considerable amount of time reviewing all the existing land uses on Artesia Boulevard and Aviation, and it was part of our Artesia Aviation Corridor Area Plan that Wendy has just pulled up now. And there was a specific economic development study or market study for the corridor, and because of some of the underlying land use issues, for example, the value of the property, it would require a much higher intensity of development in order to incentivize the turnover of the businesses and redevelopment of the corridor. Per the market analysis, it would need approximately 4-story buildings, that type of intensity. And the GPAC really thoughtfully considered that, but determined it was their determination that they were looking for more incremental organic growth. They also wanted to see what was going to happen with the Galleria, maybe play off the development of the Galleria. And really the focus turned out to be, let's retain the smaller scale and really orient the development and redevelopment of the corridor to the neighborhoods that surround it, and provide services and businesses that those neighborhoods really wanted. A lot of restaurants, some office for working opportunities, small activity areas that would then serve as let's say, incubators for some regrowth or growth and development along the corridor. So keeping a small scale, not radically changing development on the corridor, and taking the focus away from commuter services, as people drove through the corridor, and keeping them, or reorienting them to the surrounding neighborhoods.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Sean. Thank you for the fill in. You're right. There's all of that.
Yeah, there was a lot. There was a lot.
No, there is a lot. And so I appreciate that very much. And so there is a link on this website so that you can see all of the details for the Artesia, the ACAP, Artesia Aviation Corridor Plan. And it does have a lot of specifics about the details for, facade improvements and other things. So I know that Sean has a lot of kind of marching orders, next steps of things. So I'm sure you'll be hearing more about this soon, about how to continue to invest in that area and transition. So I think that's, this shows on the sidebar. I just wanted to show on every single one We will show you what's changing from the current, we'll show you the recommendations, what's changing from the current plan. When we say minor changes, we talk about either little adjustments or if we're updating how those definitions come into play so that you can look at and translate how that goes back to the table. And then also has a map of the current plan. So if you wanted to compare, you could do that there as well. Aviation is kind of an offshoot of Artesia. You know, this was something that when the group was discussing, the focus really ended up being on Artesia when we thought it was linked. And I think the way that it was looked at is that, you know, aviation really was kind of a support use and an extension of what was going on Artesia. The uses there are multifamily residential. So we've got, that's what's existing right now as these two multifamily residential, and then you've got commercial neighborhood. And so the group determined that there should be no changes at that time to this, that this still makes sense, that it ties into what Artesia is doing. And so while it's a focus area, we discussed it, but at this point, there are no changes proposed in the land plan.
No changes, but it is important to note it's within the Artesia Aviation Corridor Area Plan. So as redevelopment occurs on aviation, all those design guidelines, you know, all the other storefront improvement, facade improvement guidelines, outdoor dining, those types of incentives and development standards and guidelines will also be applied to aviation. So there should be some revitalization, we're hopeful of it, along aviation as well.
Thank you. Okay. Now I also see we're getting some questions in the chat about how many units are assigned to what areas and whatnot, and we definitely can get to that. We wanted to get through the big ideas and the changes in each one of these areas first and go over what that looked like and the recommendations, and then we can drill down more into some of those questions. So you guys can bear with us a little bit more, then we are watching the questions as they come in. All the panelists are watching them, and we're putting them in a holding bin to address after we get through each one of the areas. So thank you for your patience. So the next area we are calling the Tech District. And this was discussed as an area that really could be that area of innovation, of industry, of employment generating uses, and then allows for some supportive retail and hospitality. So it looks a little interesting here because what you'll see on the map is like purple and a red, which are, the red is the commercial flex. So that allows for you know, a variety of office and business uses and retail and neighborhood serving commercial. And then the purple hatched area is the industrial general. And so that is a light industrial, light manufacturing, warehousing, wholesale, vehicle sales, maintenance, that sort of thing. So the idea behind this was that the city is at a point where they've got to find places to accommodate additional units in the city and to meet the housing requirements. And so this was one of those areas. Remember, we were talking about a minimum half acre in size. It has access to an existing metro station. It has access to a freeway. So this in deliberation was one of the areas that could be considered for housing, potential housing, future housing. So that's why there was a residential overlay recommended for this whole area. So it's underlying industrial and commercial with a residential overlay on top. And so that would allow for apartments or other high density projects that they can be standalone 100% residential projects. You know, they would need to be specially designed and cited, but having this overlay is a critical way right now in the recommendations in this plan to be able to satisfy the housing needs. So that's something that the group deliberated quite a bit. Now, the few little changes of the underlying land uses were at one point, the current existing general plan shows this area right here as an industrial use. And then this is still commercial. So they've moved everything right on either side of the 405 becomes commercial. And then the remainder on the other side of the easement is industrial. So Sean, did you have any other?
Yeah, just another comment. The introduction of residential into this tech district, it actually was one of the original concepts and options that GPAC had considered. It was fleshed out with a lot of debate, and ultimately it was, in their first run before the state laws changed, it was removed, the residential. And the reason for the residential to even be considered up there was all about the Green Line transit station at the very north end. So it was a fairly common land planning option based on the transit-oriented development concept. So, that's the impetus that supports the residential component at this location.
Yeah, and as each project comes in, they will be required. I'm seeing questions in the chat about how you address school issues, or what happens to existing businesses there. So, this again, we would be showing that it has the capacity to do these types of things, or would allow for the opportunity for housing, but it doesn't require any of that to be built. It's up to each property owner to decide how they want to develop their land. And then they would need to, go through the proper entitlement channels, which would include, paying school fees, looking at traffic, that sort of thing.
Right. And just regarding schools, if any significant size residential development were to come in to any of these locations, in the hundred, let's say over hundreds of units, the school district would be involved with that planning process. We would be bringing them into those discussions early to flesh out if a new school would need to be provided. Certainly the development impact fees would come into play with respect to school fees. There are state fees. So they would be involved in the planning process for any large scale new residential development in any of these areas.
Great, thanks, Sean. And I see that we're getting just questions about the explicit number of units in each area. What I'd like to do is go through the big picture ideas first, and then we can get back to the whole build out and what it means for each area so that we can look at it comprehensively. So we see the question and we'll put it in the holding bin for a moment. So the next area to talk about is the Galleria. And when we say Galleria, it's not just the actual Galleria site itself, it's the larger area. So let me scroll down a little bit to the recommended plans so you can all see it. Originally, there was a designation on the site of mixed use. It was a regional commercial for a large chunk of this area. And then down here in the corner on the southwest, we had some industrial uses that were allowed. And then up in the Kingsdale area, the designations were low density residential. As you know, there's a single family neighborhood there, and then some commercial uses, as well as some commercial up here on this corner piece. And so there was definitely much debate about this area as well. And so this is another opportunity where the group talked about, we know that the Galleria has been entitled, so a new designation of mixed use transit center has been provided for that. So that kind of reflects the use that was there before and the entitlements that have been approved. The discussion about the industrial flex would be creating this like integrated light industrial incubator space, maybe some commercial hotel type of uses. So it's a little bit more of a broad application of industrial, but it's that like lighter industrial type uses and supportive uses. You'll see the hatch here as well. So this is another area where the residential overlay was recommended for those housing units. This is another one of those cases where these two areas, because they are located near the metro stop, and you already have a concentration of uses at the mall, it would seem that there would be opportunity for providing residential units there for people that would have access to light rail and to transit. So the other change and deliberation was about Kingsdale, and the recommendation was to make it multifamily residential. Now I should outline, identify, talk about the advisory committee had really actually talked about making this even higher density, maybe up to 60 dwelling units the acre, if it would help to satisfy the housing requirements, because you could make a node that is a transit-oriented kind of concentrated area of uses so that you would affect fewer uses throughout the city. When we talked to HCD to see if that would be feasible, if that's a site that they would use, because of the effort that it would take to consolidate all of these lots and to make it into a buildable site. So when we were talking about that half-acre site, it wasn't one that, in the near term that HCD could see happening. So this site has moved forward with the recommendation that the advisory committee had originally of the 30 dwelling units per acre. So know that this was kind of discussed as an opportunity for higher density, but is something that because of the requirements that HCD has, was not pursued. And so that's staying at 32 acre. Sean, am I missing anything?
I would ask Wendy if you can say what HCD is for folks.
Oh, sure. That's the State Department of Housing and Community Development, which is the approval body of the housing element. HCD.
Just one thing, Wendy, the existing CR, commercial regional designation, that also allows for housing, actually bisects in a north-south direction, that southern portion. And so we already have a lot of opportunity for higher density housing in this area. This is more, it's an expansion of that. But again, it's really playing off the transit-oriented component, that is planned for that location. So, and again, it was one of the options GPAC really considered initially in their discussions as well.
Great. Thank you.
And Wendy, sorry, can you go over kind of what an overlay is? Because I know, I think we had a question in terms of, we discussed an overlay over in the tech area and now here. So what's the idea of an overlay?
Sure. So the way that it works is that you have the underlying uses. So I will, go back when we talked about the tech district, or I'll show the proposed map here. You see, there's that purple underlying. So the underlying, just pretend that the overlay didn't exist. If we weren't doing residential there, this would be industrial flex. With the overlay, it allows for the property owner to develop with either the underlying industrial flex or with the residential overlay. So they could develop residential, standalone residential. I mean, there could still be mixed use in there too. They could take a look at that, but that gives you an opportunity to choose and more flexibility for, what can happen in those areas. Now, this again is another one of those critical pieces, because we're trying to show that, we have enough spaces to accommodate the units. And I know we need to talk about the numbers a little bit later, but, that's what the overlay does. So it's not saying it's just residential, but if it was another color underneath, it would be, the priority would be, let's just say it was commercial. That would be one of the uses. And then the other use could be residential. So the underlying is the primary use, and then residential would be the option.
And just to add, it's not an either or. It doesn't have to be all residential or all industrial. It can be a combination of both.
Yeah, definitely.
Area could be the industrial flex, and then a parcel within the area could be converted to residential.
Absolutely. Because, we talked about needing jobs, right? So there's a balance of that. So trying to find those opportunities where you can do both. The city has been limited. When we looked at it, you're a built out community. built out, meaning there are very few vacant sites for the city to go, hey, let's satisfy the requirement on those vacant sites. So we're already at kind of a disadvantage because it's looking at where can we look for these uses that are transitioning or have the potential to accommodate more flexible options on uses that are allowed there. And so that's why this is one of those options. But, you know, we really looked at these opportunities by metro stops for that concentration of use, because then that way more people get access to transportation. So, you know, it just happens to be that this is where those two metro stops are. If they were somewhere else, then we'd be looking there too. Okay, so let's talk and move over a little bit to the west, to our PCH North. So here, the land uses had some minor refinements, but you know, weren't significant changes from what was there before. Actually, maybe I'll start with the before. So when we're looking at the current general plan for North Redondo, we've got public uses, we've got commercial uses, we've got more commercial uses at the varying, you know, this is the FAR, so that floor area ratio. And then it's hard to see because the boundary lines are there, but we've got a couple low density multifamily residential uses here on the edge with a little pop of industrial over here. So the proposed changes, or the recommended land plan, shows almost something very similar. So it takes a look at the more intense commercial uses kind of on the west side of PCH. So it used to be the C2 that was on that side was more of a low intensity highway oriented commercial designation. And so the commercial flex use that's applied here allows a little bit more urban commercial designation. So it allows an FAR increase. It went from 0.5 to 1.0. So you're allowed to have more square footage there. On the east side of Catalina, or where am I? Look at my map here. The area changed from this side over here, changed to commercial neighborhood. And because we're trying to also in this area, you've got neighborhoods and we're trying to get people to walk from their homes to this area of the corridor. That on the east side, we're looking at a change to the commercial neighborhood designation, which would not allow storage and does not allow light industrial. So we're really trying to make it a more walkable corridor. These are a little bit bigger parcels, so that's why they went to that commercial flex designation. John, any commentary?
Only you'll notice a little bit of residential multifamily on the edges on the east side of Pacific Coast Highway. That's to clean up some of the nonconformities that our existing zoning designation had. It had those as commercially zoned, and they're actually multifamily and residential developments. So we've gone ahead and cleaned that up and given them the appropriate residential zoning.
Okay. Now, I'm seeing a couple questions about where the sharing the link for this map. So for those of you that may have joined a little bit later, we are actually going to give you the link to this map right after we get through the narrative on some of these things. So then you'll be able to have that, look at this as well, and then provide comments on the map. We just wanted to be able to walk through the map before everybody started commenting on it, because those would all start popping up while we're talking, and we wanted to make sure the focus was on the discussion of the land use. So we will actually share the link with you guys in this chat, and we will put it on the website, and we will share it out with social media so that everybody can have an opportunity to look at it. And although the comments are due, on the 11th by midnight, it will stay open through the Planning Commission and Council meetings, so people will have opportunity to reference this. Okay, so let's move on to PCH Central. We're almost there. We have 3 more. this Pch Central is that, it's kind of that middle spine, obviously, of PCH. It's that core. Where is my map? Oh, this one's a little funky because this is the one I told you guys about, that we have a couple areas that we want some feedback on. So I'm going to show you the existing first. So the current general plan shows from north to south a mix of high density residential, some mixed use at the core here at Torrance, and then it transitions into commercial and then high density multifamily residential here, and then back to commercial as you go further south. So that is the general makeup with some interspersed. We've got some low density multifamily here on the edges, and then some public uses as well. So this plan, for the most part, stayed the same. Ooh, this one seems tiny. But when you look at the areas that go kind of to, I guess, to Pearl, we're looking at, right? On here, it starts right here at Pearl. The uses are pretty much the same with the exception of those two lower density residential uses were changed to the multifamily residential high to be consistent with the adjacent uses and to help us with our housing element. But the mixed use was retained. And the biggest question becomes in this area right here, because this area doesn't change at all. It's the same as it was before. Between Pearl and I'm not sure what our bottom street is there. The question becomes, should this be a commercial corridor all the way down, or should this housing remain in this middle piece just south of Pearl? And so this is that area that says kind of to be determined. The advisory committee had asked that we put this out to the community, to the planning commission and council to kind of make the decision on where they want to go with this. They were kind of undecided. So in this policy area or this focus area, we actually have a survey at the bottom. It's the only way that the computer would let us do it. But if you scroll just on this one all the way down, there's a preference survey where you can pick either option A or option B and tell us which one you would like to see happen there. So the option would be with high density residential or just to have it all commercial uses. And so you can provide us additional feedback on that we can share with the decision makers. Sean?
Yeah.
I like this. It's good.
That's pretty much it. It's although the high density residential, it runs from Ruby to just south of Topaz. And
Okay.
It's really, I mean, a lot of the conversation with GPAC was, do we retain, if as you all know, you're driving down that stretch of PCH and there's little beach cottages and, little, we call it kind of the beachy vibe stretch of Pacific Coast Highway. And the debate, if you will, was, well, do we keep those residential or do we just let it all convert over and make it neighborhood commercial? Small scale commercial, that was really important to GPAC as well, not increase the intensity along that stretch of Pacific Coast Highway, keeping it low scale commercial. But again, the debate was just go ahead and transition all that beach cottage, old residential, or do we keep it? And that's the question to everybody.
And I believe, and Hal, you can correct me if I am wrong, this is the one area where when we had mixed use, the advisory committee had suggested leaving it at 35 to the acre here versus everywhere else it's 30. Is that correct?
Yeah, this was an area we brought the original general plan advisory recommendation before they went back to add housing in Farina, actually eliminated the mixed use in this area. And so bringing back the mixed use, they suggested bringing back the mixed use to account for some additional housing in South Redondo.
So it's special in this area, whereas all the other mixed use, the maximum DUs per acre is 30. This one is actually 35. It's a little bit higher. Okay. So again, there's still housing. When we're looking at all these areas, and Veronica can address this in more detail, but even though we're not seeing a hatch for an overlay, these designations that some of them that we have are still important and are still being used to help satisfy our RENA requirements. It's just, there's not as much space, the AES site was standing. And I saw a question, because maybe some people joined us late, about why AES, was not included. And so just for those people, at the time the GPAC was established, there was still ongoing discussions about the operations of the AES plant. And so that was not part of their purview or their scope to deliberate that piece. But if that is something that the community would like to see and wants to comment on that, then that gets passed on to Planning Commission and Council for their consideration and deliberation about that area as well.
Yeah, and maybe just one other comment. I'm sorry, Wendy.
Sure, of course.
So the mixed use that you see at Torrance Boulevard, that, as Hallie pointed out, that in the original designation that came out of GPAC, that had been removed. And again, because if you go back to the little cartoon, the state, pulled the ball away, and we were left looking for, housing that we had to find locations. And so the GPAC, this is one of the South Redondo locations. They said, let's put housing in South Redondo at this intersection and increase the zoning density, or the density for residential development at that location.
Two more, and I think these will be pretty straightforward. On PCH South, the current plan shows a combination of commercial uses. It shows mixed use, and then it also shows some medium density residential, which is at about 23 to the acre, 23.3. And so this is another, the southern gateway into the city. It goes back to the same thing that Sean was talking about, that kind of the beach town vibes, that feel, that scale. And so having visitor serving hotels, restaurants, offices with higher density residential, it's kind of an activity center and a node there that's being planned. So let's look at the proposed. So in this area, the main difference is that the land uses stayed the same, but the original density on the mixed use designation was 35 to the acre. So the group had suggested, as we had talked about, reducing all mixed use with the exception of Central PCH to 30 to the acre. So that is the change that occurs here. And so it should be, noted again, although you don't see a residential overlay or a hatch or anything like that, this mixed use designation is one of the land use designations that's helping us to meet our RENA numbers. So although it says there's no change in this area, there still is housing that's being accounted for in these designations. Anything else to add, Sean? We're good. All right, cool. And the very last one is Torrance Boulevard. And so the Torrance is another gateway into the city. Let me pull up the existing. And, it's the entryway to the pier and the waterfront, right? And so this is a combination currently of mostly commercial uses with a little bit of mixed use right here. And we've got a peak of single family residential here on the south side. And so again, the changes really aren't much different. Sorry, I gotta move the box out of the way here. The recommended land use plan, you'll see changes, not too much. Where the biggest changes are the residential piece goes to commercial. And then overall, it's more minor changes and there's more intense commercial uses west of Irina. So that used to be a C3 use. And so that's one of those cases where the FAR used to be 0.5. And now that it is going to the commercial flex, the FAR is now up to 1. So you allow for a more square footage in those areas. And this, again, even though it's this tiny piece here, that mixed use is another one of those areas that's helping to count toward our arena. Good, Sean?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Just so you're aware, the breaking point is where you start to see the large medical offices and the larger or more intense commercial development. And we wanted to continue that increased intensity as you go towards the higher density mixed use designation at PCH and just the more intense commercial development at PCH as well. So kind of just a lot of talk at GPAC about medical office, kind of playing off of what's happening east of the city on Torrance Boulevard in Torrance, and creating some opportunity for more intense development, and particularly office commercial and maybe medical office commercial.
Okay, and so that concludes kind of the overview of those areas. I'm going to switch back to the PowerPoint show. I did see a few questions or mention in the chat about some of the links. Maybe they aren't leaning to where we need them to, so we'll double check those as well to make sure it's all functioning the way it should be. And I still promise you that we will give you this link in about 5 more slides so that you'll have access to all of this in a moment. So let me stop the share. We can see everybody again and do a quick view share.
So Wendy, do we want to? Okay, you're going back. Okay.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say, because I wanted to put the bow on the conversation to say, so what does that mean for how many units in the city and total square feet? Because it is a little bit of a tricky conversation because we're trying to do two things at once in this workshop, which is talk about the big picture, the overall general plan and what's happening. But there are specific things that we've got to show for housing element, which are a little bit more detailed. So I wanted to just share. So when we're looking at what the recommended plan is, and again, all of the links that should be there about the build out, or at least they're on the Plan Redondo page, the build out totals and whatnot. Will all be there, but it's 34,500 units almost. And then it is about 15 million square feet of non-residential uses. So it's industrial, commercial, office, that sort of thing. So how does that compare to before? So the chart that you see over here, this is what you'll see on the website. There is a comparison of here's the recommended plan and then what the differences from the current general plan so that you can see the delta. But right now, the difference from the current general plan is that it's about 2,000 more residential units, and it is a total of non-residential square footage, about 41,000 square feet. So we're about the same for non-residential square footage. So you can see that most of the changes have to obviously do with residential, which is the focus of the housing element discussion. So where do we go from here? We're going to go back to all of the questions. I wanted to cover a few more slides about what the next steps are. So those that are joining that cannot stay for the Q&A can drop off. They can hear all of that, or they can jump on and start making comments on the map. So if you can bear with me for a few more slides on what the next steps are and what that process is, then we will go straight into those questions and start working with the rest of the team on responding to some of those things that have come up. So yes, it has been 4 years. Thank you, Chair, for reminding me. It becomes a blur. But in the first few years, what we were really looking at was developing that vision, starting to do the land use planning, really getting into what those issues are and talking to the advisory committee about what things need to change and just debating the different land uses. We are, in the last couple years, have been doing the land use planning. So that's where you see this land plan that has come about, and coming up with a recommended land use plan. The housing element is underway. And then ultimately, as we go forward and the council makes a recommendation on the land plan to us, if they give us a blessing on the land plan, then the housing element will move forward for adoption and review by HCD, and then adoption by council, hopefully in the fall. But the general plan will still keep moving. There'll still be goals and policies, drafting and writing that we need to do after that. So the environmental studies will start. We need a land plan, a project description. So when I presented to you, here's the total square footage and the total units, that's generally what we need to land on to be able to start all of our technical studies for the environmental analysis, because they need something to analyze and look at what all of the potential impacts are. It doesn't constitute adoption of the plan, but we need at some point something to study. So that helps to start that time. And then hopefully in next year, we'll start to see, finalization of the EIR and starting to get into adoption hearings. Now, I know it goes a little bit further than that because we have Coastal Commission adoption and we also have a vote. But this is just the general path of getting us to kind of the next couple of years. So as far as the General Plan Advisory Committee goes, they have hung in there and we have greatly appreciated it. I mean, it's very rare to have a group that stays this committed with that many members for this long of a period. They have 5 meetings that the council has authorized left. And those meetings are to review the actual goals and policies for the land use element. We've already talked about the open space element a little bit. So it'll be looking at some refined goals and policies for that. We've got some discussions with them about the safety element and noise element, and then pulling the whole plan together. So this land use plan is one piece of it, but then it's the entire general plan that they will take a look at and provide comments on into a draft. And so we're hoping that, we'll start holding those meetings again. I said summer, fall, we're still figuring out, meeting protocols, and our focus is on getting the housing element first because we've got to meet these state mandates of October. The immediate next steps that are coming up are the meeting on midnight on the 11th, which is Sunday, that those virtual comments are due on the map. Now, if you have comments that are not specific to a parcel, you can always email those to the Plan Redondo site as well. And I'll give that link to you in a minute. But from the reason we need to close the comments on Sunday night is because we will be going to Planning Commission that week, and we want to try to look at the comments and feedback we've been able to get from the community so that we can share that with them for their discussion. The following week, we will be taking the same discussion to City Council. So as either Chair or Sean was saying, that there are multiple opportunities for you to still continue to come provide feedback and listen to the deliberations of the decision makers on those. So at this point, if you would like to stay on, we are here and we're going to go through and start opening up that. We've got some of your questions. So I know that Brandy and Sean and others have been kind of tracking those as we've been going, and which ones we've been able to answer per our conversation and which ones are still kind of outstanding. We have Veronica here as well, so she can answer some of those more detailed housing questions. But if this is enough for you and you're ready to jump off on the map, or you just want to look at the map at the same time, we've provided the link here on the screen. And I believe, can someone provide that link in the chat to all participants as well? So if they don't have to try to read it and type it, that would be great. Like I said, if you don't have a specific comment on the map, if you could, if you wanted to send an email, I know we've already received many comments in advance of the meeting and questions. You can send them to the Plan Redondo email. But please, I know there are some comments that have been showing up in the chat. If you could make sure you also provide those to us in the Plan Redondo or on the map, we would appreciate it, because we're not using this chat as the record keeping for the comments that are coming in. This is for us to help figure out what questions you guys needed answered.
Yeah, Wendy, if I may, I know that Plan Redondo project website wasn't working. If anybody had joined after we shared that chat, it may not have gone through. So we'll go ahead and reshare that particular link.
Okay.
And we'll also share the My Social Pinpoint, which it looks like Amanda just shared that. So.
Great. And Wendy, could you just go back to that one slide? I just want to announce, Brandy and I were at the city council meeting last night, and they authorized additional meetings. So just to get everybody's calendar, if you're interested in following this through, the council also has a meeting on this land plan on May 4th, May 11th, and May 18th, if necessary. So there's plenty of opportunities upcoming at both the Planning Commission and multiple meetings with the City Council.
So the discussion is far from over. But yeah, so that, the goal from tonight was to at least provide the foundation for how we got here, and a lot of the things the group, the advisory committee, the city had to take into consideration, and the trade-offs and that sort of thing. So that way, the additional comments can come, and we can get that feedback from the community on other things to consider. Because the sites were so limited, if there are other sites we haven't looked at, that's, we're open to those as well. I know the advisory committee had suggested that 190th piece that, wasn't originally part of the conversation. So, okay, well, so with that.
Wendy, I just want to real quick, there was a comment about the concern of the overlay, and is this going to, is there eminent domain, or are we taking people's property? And I think that goes back to one of the earlier slides that you had provided. What the changes to the land use would do, it's not requiring that those units be built. It's not forcing that they have to be constructed. It's certainly not requiring a property owner to sell their property. And it's not even authorizing the project. What it is doing is it's allowing, it's planning for the capacity for the housing. And with that overlay, I think there was another question on how do you plan for that, and making sure the different uses are there and planned in a well laid out manner. And just where when we're talking about the overlay, we're also looking at what would be the percentage of the space that could actually be utilized for housing. So it's not just that housing will go everywhere in those sites, but rather that there's a percentage of that acreage that could be utilized for housing. And that's just to start off on answering a few of the questions.
Yeah, and I think, one of the other questions, and this could be a long night if we get into all the details of numbers, but it's like, how does that break out? What are our assumptions and things for the different areas? And if you look at the build out summary, and I just don't know, because Hallie, I know this was like a combination of things. I don't know if we have those available just to say what our assumptions were. Actually, I think you did do that. Just for the areas to just get a ballpark range. So if we were, estimating what each area could accommodate, it was about how many units in the tech district, or Veronica, maybe, from what we were looking at from our discussions with the advisory committee.
Do we want to pull up the slide or the exhibit of the recommended land use plan projected build out, and where we've got
the table?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have that one up, so that was the one.
I can share that. Okay. All right. Okay. So.
And Hallie, can you zoom in on that a little bit?
Is it hard to see?
Well, it's on mine, it is. So I don't know if we go side by side. We also, for those that, if it's hard for you to see, there's the view options button up at the top. And if you click on that, you can do a zoom ratio, and it'll allow you to zoom in on your own computer, if it's hard for you to see.
And, you know, the areas that I think we got a lot of questions on are two, you know, the tech district as well as the Galleria. And let's see, those are the residential overlay. So here's the commercial flex. This is the northeast corner of the tech center. And this shows the projected build out for that location. And that would yield up in the red hatched area. And I wish I could have a dual screen to show the land use area, but we can kind of go back to it. That could generate 450 dwelling units. And again, these will be refined through the policy discussions upcoming, but with the overlay now at the density that we have on the plan, with it 30 to 45 dwelling units per acre, we could have a yield of 450 units. And then the other area that's in the tech center, that's the industrial general down here, and that yields the remainder of that tech center yields 650 units at build out. I think some of those too, Hallie, you can correct me, are down on 190th as well.
Yeah, so it's between those two categories, it's about 1,000, and about 50 of those units are down on 190th.
Okay.
So it's about 15 is on 190, 950 up in the tech district.
Okay, so about 1,000 at the tech district and 50 down on 190th. And then if we look at the commercial flex, that is, let's see, no, I'm sorry, the mixed use. Where's our residential?
It's under the industrial flex, Sean.
Okay, okay, there it is.
About 400 units in the Galleria.
This one here, about 400. So the area by the Galleria would yield about 400 units. So those are the two locations. So, you know, our arena 2490, we're getting capacity at those two locations potentially for about 1,500 units, and including 190th. So then there's another 1,000 units that we pick up in the other locations that Veronica has identified as included in our sites inventory for our housing element. And I don't know if you want to walk through those. You go to that exhibit in the PowerPoint that shows the housing element sites. That might be a good place to talk about each unit, or the unit counts that we're picking up, if we want to share that.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Veronica.
Yeah, I don't think I have that exhibit at hand right now.
Oh, okay. Let me see if I.
Is it the one in the show that I showed?
Yeah, the one in the show.
No, that's fine. I can pull that up.
Okay.
This one?
Yes. So again, a combination of this location, the tech, the Galleria, and 190th yields about 1,500 units, and then the remainder, and this Veronica is going to need to step in. There's a lot of sites that aren't being developed, or that are just turning over in our residential neighborhoods that are also included. So,
we've done an analysis essentially of residential recycling. The city has been building primarily recent development anyway, a lot of recycling R2 and R3 properties that are turning 1 unit into 2 or 3 units, or 2 units into 3 or 4 units. Those do count, and they do contribute to the city's regional housing needs allocation, but because of the magnitude of the change, we are not able to count them towards lower income housing, because you are the size of the properties or the projects are not necessarily high enough or large enough to qualify as a feasible lower income project, regardless of density. And so even if you, in some of your R3 properties, they may be higher density, but if you're yielding only a net increase of 1 unit or 2 units, that counts towards your moderate and above moderate income RHNA, but it does not count towards your lower income RHNA. And so we do have a lot of that included as part of the strategy for the regional housing needs allocation. We also are utilizing ADUs, accessory dwelling units. Now, the only problem with accessory dwelling units is that we don't get to count the potential of 1 unit or 2 units on each single family lot. We can only get credits for accessory dwelling units based on your past trend of the last 3 years. So if the trend is about 20 or 30 units a year, we can only project it to be about 200 or 300 units over the next 8 years. So that is also part of your strategy. You also have some mixed use properties that we are including in the sites inventory. But again, because there are not a lot of sites available within your mixed use, we don't have the enough capacity to meet the regional housing needs allocation. Having said that, I think Wendy said the same thing, Brandy said the same thing, and Shauna said it too. Again, there is no requirement for the units to be built. It's just to show that it's a planning capacity. It may be built, it may not be built. It really is the market that controls what's going to happen on those properties. As part of this planning effort, no property owner is required to offer up their property as part of the development. So that's, I think it has to be clear that there's no eminent domain, there's no requirement to offer your property. Nobody needs to sell, nobody needs to move if you don't want to.
So I see a question here, Veronica,
Yeah.
about, all the low income housing will be in North Redondo. Can you speak a little bit to that? It looks like the majority is per this plan, but there are other locations that do provide, that have the high enough density in South Redondo to also develop.
Yeah, and and again, it's not low income housing. The city is not building low income housing. The sites are feasible for low income housing based on density, but it's not required to be built as low income housing. And the state basically used density as a proxy to feasibility. Essentially, what the state law is saying, that at 30 units to the acre or above, it's more feasible for an affordable housing developer to come and build affordable housing with a reasonable amount of subsidies. And it's not suggesting that the units built at market would be affordable to low income. It's not suggesting these sites are all going to be built as low income. It's just that at this density, it's more financially feasible for a nonprofit or for somebody else to build affordable housing. And I think the bottom line is that there is not enough money in the state that can offer to build anywhere near what your RHNA is in terms of low-income housing. So we're only offering feasibility. We're not required to build the units.
Hey, Sean, I see a couple questions about Beach City's health district and their project and what's going on there. So I didn't know if you could, provide an update or, anything on that.
I think I'll turn this over to Brandy. She's diving in deep on that.
Okay.
Yeah, so Beach City's Health District has a project that they are interested in. They've just completed their draft environmental review of that. And with that proposed project, there are assisted living units in that. One of the things that we discussed with Beach City's Health District, and this is without any knowing, not presuming what any approval or disapproval of the project would be. But from what they're proposing, would any of those units qualify for affordable? And it really ended up being a small number. And some of the units, for example, the memory care units, because they don't have their own separate kitchen areas, can't even be qualified as housing units. So it is something that we evaluated. And it was something that the GPAC had recommended we look at that particular site, look at the 190th site. There, I want to, I know that there have been some questions about the AES site or other locations. And as Wendy had mentioned, when the GPAC was charged with coming up with the land use recommendations, at that time, that particular site was not one of the focus areas, was not something for their consideration. That being said, if you have comments on that, or if you have comments on other locations or suggested areas for us to consider, or even questions on could density be increased in a certain location, those are things that you can put into that social pinpoint map. And I think that did we make that live when we went to the Q&A? I believe that Amanda had shared the link on that. So that's where you're going to want to go and provide those comments on those specific locations. But Beach Cities Health District, it will contribute a few units towards the affordable and towards meeting our overall arena, but it's not significant. It's not going to make a significant difference. And then for the ADUs, there was the question on ADUs. I think Veronica answered that it's based on the past 3 years and what has come in. It's not just assuming that all of them could be built at one time. And then finally, there was another question, and I'm just talking about like kind of that residential land use, that there was a question about could the R1 be rezoned to R2, R3? And this was something that came up when we were doing our RENA appeal to SCAG, because we appealed our number wanting it to be reduced. A lot of municipalities did, and only one actually got a reduction, and that's because their area was in a spillway for a dam. But for our appeal, one of the things we presented was the comparison of our municipality and nearby municipalities on our mix of zones that are single family and zones that are multifamily, and ours are significantly more, have already been upzoned to the R2, R3, and we have a much smaller percentage. It's almost reverse of what you'll see in Manhattan Beach or Hermosa Beach and some of the other nearby communities. So although you could rezone R1, that was not something that the city council wasn't interested in having the R1 or R2 or R3 being a focus area.
I'm seeing a couple questions about just, I'm catching some of the older questions. We were talking about when Sean was saying the 4 additional council meetings that are coming up. The question was whether or not the public can comment in those meetings as well. Absolutely. And then another question was whether or not all of the questions and comments we're getting here tonight will be published. This meeting is being recorded, so anybody can come back and watch all of that. I'm not sure with the amount of time we have between now and Planning Commission and all the comments that will come in on the map in an email that we'll be able to transcribe all of those Q&A, but it is something we were going to be looking at between now and all the different council meetings. If there's those recurring questions that come up, possibly putting something together for that. Are there other questions, Lena and Hallie and others that you see that we didn't get to?
Yeah. I'll just go. I've been taking some notes from the beginning. So we had a few common questions early on. As a follow-up to the description of the FAR, there was a question about who decides what the FAR ratio in each area would be.
Sure. I mean, and the general answer on that is that there's depending on the type of development, there's kind of some rules of thumb in planning about development kind of showing up at a certain FAR. But the reality is we make recommendations at those FARs, and it's the Planning Commission and Council that ultimately make the decision on what those will be. I don't know if Brandy and Sean, you want to weigh in on if there's more to say about it.
And I would just point out FAR is more typically in our municipality utilized when you're looking at non-residential. For residential, I think probably the more significant measurement tool is the dwelling units per acre. That really demonstrates what the density is versus the FAR would say how large a particular unit could be.
And then we also had a question about what does it mean to have a residential overlay on an industrial or commercial district? Does that mean that it could be?
I think we covered that one a little bit, where it was, you could do either or. You don't have to do all residential on the whole thing, or you could do just industrial, or you could do, when we say the whole thing, if we're more looking at a particular area, it doesn't mean that whole area would be all industrial or all residential. It just means each property owner has that option of industrial or residential.
And there was a related comment asking about how we would handle the land use compatibility issues that might come up between having residential uses next to the industrial uses up there, and if that was considered.
Yeah, you go ahead, Brandy.
No, I was just going to say that would come with the actual drafting of the zoning. I did touch on this a little bit with the, if you have a percentage that can be developed at, you have a limit on the percentage that can be developed as residential, but there'll be other components that need to go into that. I think that'll also be fleshed out a bit more in the goals and policies of what we're trying to get to for design, and that can then guide what that zoning changes will be.
Ultimately, the zoning would incorporate a lot of development standards that would require certain buffers, all sorts of compatibility related standards to ensure that they were as compatible as they could be, and they were integrated well and safely. And there's another question, kind of a follow-up on that. What happens to the current businesses in the tech area? Well, I mean, nothing unless the property owner wants to propose some change in the use of their structure or their property. So these, again, no one would be forcing these existing businesses out. They would be maintained, by the business and the property owner, until there was a desire for those to turn over, if there was.
And I'm seeing, so shifting gears a little bit, another question that that's come up a couple times related to ADUs or accessory dwelling units. And so when we were saying, the established residential neighborhoods stay as they are, I think that was a little bit, for the most part they do, but there are, and Brandy and Sean, you could talk a little bit more about what you guys have been doing with ADUs, or Veronica, how those are counted, because they are allowed in those established neighborhoods. And so that is definitely one of the factors that's included in the housing element, is those accessory dwelling units. So can you guys talk a little bit more about that?
With that, it's still, again, going to be based on the number that have been constructed over the last few years as to what we can estimate will be built in the upcoming years. However, the SCAG, the council of governments here, has proposed a methodology to determine what the affordability would be, like how many of those units could you count towards affordable, and that has been approved by the state, that methodology or calculation, and that actually allows for more of our units ADU units that are proposed to count towards affordable.
Okay, kind of to put a number to that, I think the SCAG determination was, I think it's like 64% or so.
I have the exact number, just hold on.
Yeah.
It's very favorable in terms of allowing you to count ADUs as potentially affordable housing. And is in your region of LA County, I believe we can count up to 64, 65% of that in lower income, and a little bit for moderate income. And so essentially, what we have to do is to establish the trend between 2018 and 2020, because that's when the new laws came into effect. So we take in three annual average over those 3 years and project that into the 8 years of the housing element planning period, and we can allocate about 60% of those being lower income. We can, to some extent, anticipate a little bit more increase if there is an increasing trend in terms of our ADU. But on the other hand, given the magnitude of the issue we're dealing with, it cannot be the only strategy that we rely on, but it is an important resource that the city has.
Great, thanks, Veronica. So I'm looking at the meeting is scheduled to go until 8:30. So we have a few more minutes for some additional.
I did see there were a couple of questions related to age-restricted housing, because the question came up about the impacts to schools if you're adding districts that allow housing. Veronica, can you speak to that? Does that count towards?
Yeah, certainly. I saw that question too. What we are doing from a planning perspective is we are planning for the building type, whether it's multifamily, townhomes, flats, or single family or duplex. We are not planning based on who is going to occupy those housing. There's no restriction as to how much senior housing you're going to build. But we do have to allow for the housing to occur, but who is going to occupy it is really, again, based on the market. There's certainly a market for senior housing in the city. And so if there are developers who come in and do a lot of senior housing, they can take up a lot of those land that zone for higher density for senior housing or age-restricted housing. However, from a planning perspective, as a planning document, as a city, we cannot predestinate how much of that is going to become senior housing.
No, I just wanted to interject because I saw some questions regarding the format of tonight's meeting in terms of, whether we take public comment or what have you. So I just want to clarify that it's a community meeting, which is different than, say, a public hearing subject to the Brown Act. So, this is not a meeting body. It's the format of a community meeting where we present the information, we take questions, and then your comments and any public input you can provide to the actual planning commission when they hold their hearing next. That'll be April 15th, next Thursday, and then the city council will also hold several hearings subsequent to that, April 20th, May 4th, and probably a couple of meetings that they decide on after that. So that will be the forum to provide your public comment to those bodies that will actually have the final decision-making authority on this plan. So the forum tonight, it's different than, say, a Brown Act meeting. So this is just a community meeting where we present the information and then take comments, and then basically for you to take back and then form your comments and then submit those later for planning commission and city council.
And we will be taking back the feedback that's submitted through that the social pinpoint map that we just shared the link for. Maybe we can share that again. And then as well, we will, I believe that Wendy had provided the email, is it planredondo@redondo.org. If anybody wants to submit official comments, that those will then go to there it is, planredondo.
Brandy, I want to make one correction with the ADUs. We can count, because we're in the region 1 of the report from SCAG, we can count 60% of the ADUs as lower income, 6% as moderate income, and 34% as above moderate income. So I just want to be precise, and when you see the housing element report, that it should reflect this number, not the 64% we mentioned before.
Great, thank you, Veronica.
And Wendy, I think I saw some questions. I think kind of just to kind of go back to what is the housing breakdown that is being proposed in terms of you know, a moderate kind of like what are those thresholds for medium income, low income, above moderate?
So is that a Veronica question? So the question is the actual income levels, or is it perfect?
Yeah, I know you.
Yeah,
I know you might.
That's a good reminder that we do have more detailed FAQs on the specifics of the housing element, because they are very detailed on the website.
There it is. So yeah, Veronica, if you want to maybe, yeah, I don't know if you can see it well enough.
Yeah, I'm zooming in from your
Okay.
report right now.
Let me try to
Well, the regional housing needs allocation
Sorry.
is divided into income categories, just like Wendy and everybody's been talking about. Can you scroll up?
Sorry.
Of the 2,490 units, about 38% of your arena is very low income, considered to be people who are making households that are making no more than 50% of the area median income. 20% of that would be low income for people who are making no more than 80% of the area median income. And moderate income, 20% is up to 120% of the moderate income. Above moderate income is 22% of your arena. But these numbers that you're seeing, 56,000, less than 56,000 is for a family of 4. The income of each household is adjusted by household size and is adjusted annually. So this is just reflecting 2020 numbers and for a family of 4. So a very low income senior is, as a one-person household, the limit is going to be lower. So when you do affordable housing for senior household, you're not dealing with $56,000. When you look at a single person, what is very enlightening to a lot of us when we talk about housing and affordability is most of the kids who graduate from college today with a 4-year college degree, they are falling into the very low income category or low income category. And even if you have a family of 4 with a 2-person household that are making a good income, they're probably still going to be moderate income in LA County. So these income limits really reflect primarily people who are working poor, consider poor just because the housing is so unaffordable. House cost of living is so unaffordable in LA County. So, but they're not. The majority of these people are not really like poverty level. They're really working poor people, and also people who are just retired with limited income.
So Veronica, in order to qualify for a site, or in order for a site to qualify as a site that has capacity for accommodating these lower incomes, what's the density that it has to be?
The default density is 30 units to the acre. Again, you need to have zoning that allows 30 units to the acre or more. But just to re-emphasize, we're not saying that they will be built as lower income. It's just that at that density, it's more financially feasible for a nonprofit developer or developer to acquire or to pursue funding at the federal level or the state level to provide for affordable housing. But there is not enough funding available to build that many units of affordable housing out there. It's very competitive. And so the reality is, if they are being built, the majority of these housing is not going to be low income.
One additional question now that we're on the affordable housing side of things, there was a question about how do we get low income housing in Redondo Beach when developers are moving to get market rate, even at those higher densities. So one of the things, and this isn't going to be the full answer of how do you get the affordable units, but the city is working on developing what's called an inclusionary housing ordinance. And that's a whole nother conversation that we could talk about for another 2 hours. That is something that we're working, Veronica is our consultant working on that with us. And what that will mean is projects of a certain size will have to have, and it may be tiered of different sizes, have different levels of affordability that will be required as part of their project.
Right.
And it's not just because they went for the housing density bonuses, but rather it will be required of the project itself. And that's what we're working on, developing that ordinance. I don't think we need to go into much more detail. I would just say continue to track that in the city council agendas.
And I think, Brandy, the advantage of that approach really is to disperse, if there are lower income being built, opportunities to disperse it throughout the city. And so
Correct.
It not be concentrated.
Right.
So, Veronica, there was another question asking about if there's any consideration for homes where rooms are being rented out or where family members move in with their families.
That actually does not count towards regional housing needs assessment. Regional housing, the RHNA only counts new units. So if it's an existing unit, it doesn't get credit for it, even though that there are certainly the part of the reason actually why the RHNA is so large today compared to 8 years ago is the fact that there is overcrowding. People are living with another household when they could have live in their own housing unit but cannot afford it. And so by providing the additional housing units, these overcrowding situation could be relieved. So think about it as the RHNA is offering opportunities for housing units that are currently overcrowded because people are sharing housing arrangement. They've got the opportunity to get to housing, additional housing in the city rather than cramming into existing units.
I'm seeing a pretty technical question that is concerning how we would provide water for future development, for future housing units. There's some bills noted here, SB 221 and SB 610 require governments to review water supplies before approving developments. And that act is absolutely what would happen. But even before that, Wendy's company, PlaceWorks, is working on the environmental impact report, which is going to be assessing, all the potential impacts, including public services and infrastructure service, as part of that document to support the type of residential or the amount of residential and all other types of development that are contemplated in the plan. So that'll get fleshed out initially with the environmental impact report that accompanies the plan, and then following the development process of any other project that comes forward, that's always a consideration at the time of review of the project as well.
And Sean, to piggyback off of that, I was seeing questions too about traffic again. It's like if we have all these new units, it's the same thing. Like when that goes through, when we come up, or the council looks at that recommended plan and says, okay, this is what we're going to study. We run the traffic analyses, We look at the services, we look at all of that, and then the environmental impact report provides either the mitigation that needs to be provided or, just ways that can be addressed. So, that's the time that those will be brought up. So,
if I can just real quick, somebody had a follow-up question regarding the inclusionary housing ordinance and what the timing would be. That isn't tied to these particular planning processes. That is happening at a much faster pace. It does not have to go through the GPAC evaluation. It's we'll be taking the recommendations for the parameters back to City Council for them to finalize how they want to move forward with the ordinance, and expect to have that probably in the next 6 months.
I saw some questions related to the units that will be built at the Galleria, and I believe also what is happening with the Foundry property, and are those units applied to?
So the Galleria project, they have an entitlement for 300 residential units. 60 of those units are required to be affordable. I think for low income, in the low income category. So that's the Galleria project.
And so far, I think we are counting them because they're not likely going to be permitted until after July. Is that a correct assumption?
That's correct.
Correct. Yeah.
If they're not permitted until after July, they get the double count for both the 5th and the 6th cycle. Even though we counted it before, as long as they're not permitted until after July, we get to also count it for the 5th cycle.
I think the same answer that would apply to the Foundry project.
And just so we are clear on what 5th and 6th cycle are. 5th cycle is our current general plan, or our current housing element in that time frame. And if you recall, the next one is due in October. That then starts the 6th cycle. So what Veronica's saying is, because they weren't built in that 5th, they can be counted towards being built in the 6th as long as they're not already permitted.
That would be the same for the 36 units at the Foundry location.
Mm-hmm.
We just got a question. It looks like people are starting to use the map, which is great. But there is a question that said the map that's linked has some comments in the green and red flags. Whose position do these reflect? Well, those are people that are already going on and providing their own comments. So it's whoever has reviewed it. So this is the public comment map. So anything you see on there is not, if there's a pin, with either a green, a red, or a yellow, that is something that somebody has added to the map since we have started this meeting. So anything that the city has provided is in the sidebar, and that's all of the information and the links. We will not be commenting on that map. All the comments that come in are those from the public.
And then we've had quite a few comments. I know we addressed it a little bit with senior housing, but we've had quite a few comments about the impacts that new housing will have on the schools in the school district. Does somebody want to talk about how that is handled in development?
Yeah, other than paying fees, I mean, every project that comes in has to be reviewed. So we had mentioned that a little bit earlier. And that's part of the entitlement process. Every project is, provided. It's a coordination with the school district already. So they do their calculations on anticipated student generation rates. I mean, I'm sure they're tracking a little bit too where all these land uses go, because they have to estimate what they think their student populations are going to be. So, that gets handled at the time of the application. So I don't know, if we were, and I'm fine staying after if everybody wants to, answer a few more questions. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I know that there have been a lot of comments in the chat, and we've tried to get to all of them. So we'll kind of do maybe a last call, see if there's a few others that any of the team has seen that we haven't addressed. And then if we haven't, we always do our best to do that here, but please, you can always follow up with staff after if we don't get to your comment, if we missed it.
I'm running through the Q&A. There was, at the outset of the meeting, our direction was to put questions in the chat, but we have a lot in the Q&A, so I'm just going to kind of run through some of these.
All right, we'll just double check.
Well, Sean's looking at that. We had a question earlier on asking if we were to revert the mixed use on PCH South back to 35 dwelling units to the acre instead of reducing it to 30. How much more housing could we get on that site? And that is something that we looked at. And I believe the number was somewhere around 40 units if we change that density back.
Yeah, I think the bottom line is that it's not so much how much land is being zoned for a particular land use, but how much within that zone, how many properties would actually qualify as a site with redevelopment potential within the near term. So you can have a whole stretch of area that's zoned for mixed use, but that may not have a lot of opportunities for recyclable properties.
Got it. And then, okay, I've pulled up the Q&A as well, I see. There's some questions about like the timing of when all of this would take effect. So one of the questions was like, around Kingsdale and that whole area, if that was to change, what would that be? So it's the adoption of the general plan. So when we were looking at that schedule, that is next year, even further, because we still have Coastal Commission after that, we have a vote and depending on the order. So it probably wouldn't officially go into effect for a couple of years yet, right, John and Brandy? Like all of these changes?
Correct.
Yes. And Wendy, and just to reiterate, then that it will go back to City Council again, and it will go to a public vote, right?
Yeah. So once we go through this, and they do give us a recommended plan to study, then it goes to public hearing to adopt the plan. Then it will go to public hearing with the Coastal Commission, and then, or I don't know the exact order. Yeah, it'll go to Coastal Commission vote, and then a Coastal Commission. But there's going to be multiple times to weigh in on this. The challenge is that we still need to meet the housing element requirements, so we have to get something to them by October-ish. So there are some decisions that need to be made on the fast track. About these, so we can't wait the 2 years to make meet these housing requirements that Veronica is getting to. So I think that's some direction. Now, Veronica, can you talk to everybody about if we've got the general plan and they're designated in the general plan when they actually the changes need to be made by?
Can I ask something before you answer that, just as a cue up or after Veronica answers? Just basically, once the housing element goes out, and the general plan is basically now available, is going to go to public vote. Is there any reconciliation that needs to be done? And I'll sort of with the housing element and the adopted general plan, or is there's no way to make any changes to the general plan after the housing element's been adopted? I'll just cue that one up for after Veronica answers her question.
You're muted, Veronica.
She couldn't get away with this
well today for not having to unmute myself that way. One thing is that the housing element allows us 3 years, or the housing element law allows us to up to 3 years from the statutory deadline of the housing element, which is October 2021, to make the general plan, to adopt the general plan and the zoning, to have that kind of in place in order to implement the land use strategy that you're using to meet the RHNA. And so we have up to 3 years to complete not only the general plan, but you have to also do the zoning at the same within that 3 years as well. And regarding whether you have the ability to make changes to the housing element or not, yes, you do. And it just depends on what type of changes you're making. If you're making changes that would improve the housing element, if you're making changes that you don't even need to go back to the state, you can just make the changes. But if you're changing how you're going to meet the regional housing needs allocation substantially, then you would have to go back to the state and re-adopt the housing element, because they need to being able to review your strategy for meeting the regional housing needs assessment is the most important component of the state certification process. So if they approve the housing element based on your proposed land use strategy today, but as the housing element is adopted and the general plan has additional changes, and that changes the way you're going to meet your regional housing needs allocation, you have to take it back to the state.
Okay. Thank you.
There was one additional question that didn't seem to overlap with the chat that was in the question and answer field that said, have there been attempts to reach out to other beach cities for lessons learned? And, you know, any equivalent exercises, and, you know, in talking with Veronica, you know, we mentioned that there were a lot of municipalities that even appealed their RENA number. And I don't know if there is a municipality out there that's happy about their RENA number. But I can say, you know, like in talking with Veronica, that a lot of, you know, most municipalities, how they're meeting their RENA obligation is having to revisit their zoning. And, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, Veronica, if there are other.
This is absolutely the magnitude of the RENA is something that I've never seen. And I've been working on housing element for a long time. And definitely every jurisdiction, not every jurisdiction, the majority of the jurisdictions that are working on the housing element, they are rezoning, upzoning. I can give you an example, like the city of Torrance has a housing corridor study that's going on. Their RENA is about, I think, 9,000 units or something like that. It's like very large as well. So there's no way that the city of Torrance can meet the RENA without rezoning and upzoning. So they're looking at a lot of things. City of Gardena, a very small, very built out community. Their RENA is 5,700 units. They're doing a lot of rezoning, but virtually, I would say 80%, I don't want to be as bold to say 90%, but 80% of the jurisdictions that you're dealing with, they're doing rezoning and upzoning as part of the, in order to meet the RENA. There's almost no way that a community can do that without making some changes. Some of your, again, close by neighbors, El Segundo, doing the same thing.
I just saw another question come in, and then maybe we can wrap it up. And if we missed anybody's questions after that, you know, please do, you know, send the comments via the plan redondo@redondo.org email. The question is, did the cancellation of the waterfront project impact the number of low-income housing units that would have been added? Actually, that project was never scheduled to have, it was commercial based. It was not housing based. So that the waterfront project not moving forward would not have impacted the housing.
And Brandy, I have one more because I've seen it come in a little bit late. I know we're like,
I know.
I feel like we would stay here till midnight to answer.
We appreciate all of you that are still on. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, because there's a lot of you that have hung with us. You know, just back to the AES question too. You know, what's like, why isn't it on there? How do we get it on there? This is the opportunity. If you think that's a great place to consider housing and you want it in that spot, you put it on the map. People have already provided comments. Our job here is to provide the feedback that we're getting. You know, here's the recommended plan that came out of GPAC. Here's the additional comments we received from the public of things that, you know, they would like you to consider. We share that with Planning Commission next week and Council the following week and 4 more times after that. So this is your opportunity to weigh in. So we appreciate, you know, any of that feedback, any comments, and then we can take a look at what that means and forward that information to Planning Commission and Council.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be just that site. It's other locations, like I'd mentioned earlier, where you're thinking the could we increase density here? Those are the things that, as we receive those comments, we're going to start evaluating if some of those are feasible for us to meet our RENA number. There, you know, for example, we have that limit on the ADUs, the amount that we can count. We have the you know, where do we hit the ability to count something towards affordable housing? Well, that 30 dwelling units per acre. So those are the different things that we have to really consider of what would HCD allow us to consider or take into consideration as meeting or going towards our RENA obligation.
Yeah, and so maybe what I'll do, in closing, should I pull it up the slide again of how everybody can comment? I think that would be a good.
Yeah. I think there is one additional clarification question, I think, for the social pinpoint in terms of, I guess it says the red and green flags. You know, I like this land use. Is it intended meaning you like it for the current zoning or the proposed?
The recommended plan. So what we are recommending moving forward. So thank you for that. We'll make sure we add that into the instructions if it's not clear. So that's usually what we do. The hard part is we would love to do this in person with you and have maps all around and show you the before and after. And so we appreciate your patience in doing this virtually. So the idea would be, you know, if you're looking at the current one and you like something better there, just tell us, you know, change it back to the old plan. So we'd like you to comment on the recommended uses and then go from there.
I've got two things. Can we pull up the map to see what it's looking like after the meeting? Are we able to go live to it and see all the we don't have to read any of the comments. I just want to see the flags on it, just to see if there's any that are, and then before we wrap up, just to bring up the slide with the dates of Planning Commission and City Council. So
I'm not seeing them yet.
Does it need to be refreshed?
Maybe. That's probably it. That's probably it. Thank you.
Oh, there you go.
Who's driving this thing?
Oh, there you go.
I was like, that can't be true. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Obviously, we're going to see some clusters in some areas. That's great. And thank you guys for doing that. And so
let's not read them. Just to show that this is actually live and it's working from a technology standpoint, that we're getting the live feedback on the map.
Yeah.
This is really great. And
that's great, Nick.
For anybody who's still listening, to please go onto the map and do this.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Brandy mentioned it. You know, I'm looking through a lot of the questions and answers, and there's a lot of comments. You know, why didn't the committee look at this, or why didn't they do that, or there should be this, or there should be that. You go to that social pinpoint map and put those comments in there.
Right, and if you have, you know, questions or you want to just have a refresher on some of the things we discussed tonight, we do have the FAQ, the frequently asked questions, on that website, the city's website, that can kind of remind you of you know, what are we looking at and what are we evaluating.
Yeah, and I'll share the links again, and we'll put those all up on the website. Tomorrow, we will also have the PowerPoint, a PDF of the PowerPoint up as well, so that if people want to flip through the actual show. But we were hoping that by using Social Pinpoint to talk through the issues, that it would make you more familiar with that, and you'd be able to use that resource as well. So I think with that, that's the meeting, and we look forward to your comments at the Planning Commission and Council. So tell your friends. We'll post it on social media. Please share that, and we'd love to see a ton of comments. And thanks for all the feedback too. As the city is doing these things virtually, it's helpful to hear what works well, what you guys liked, what you know, we can do better, so that way we can make it most interactive for everyone. So with that,
great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.